So this is something I don't really talk about very often at all, but I think it's important that how I was brought up and my story, it's not something which is actually that unusual. So when I was 2, I think, my mum and dad divorced, and there were very good reasons for that, and I'm not going to go into them here. But it did mean that me, my younger brother and my older sister were all deprived of that male role model, because although we went to live with my mum's parents, so my granddad and grandma, it's not the same, is it? It's not like having that person who you look up to immediately and know that they are the person that you should aspire to be. Now, as it happens, I wouldn't have aspired to be my dad. He was a drunk and a smoker. But it did mean that basically my mum was bringing us 3 up on her own. And it was only really with the help of my grandma and granddad that we could function as a family. Now, on top of that, my brother actually died when I was about 6 through some tragic circumstances. And of course, it was a shock to me at the time, but I was 6. I didn't really understand it, and I didn't really have enough memories to be somebody who was going to grieve heavily over this, as far as I was concerned anyway. But what that meant was that we were left with my sister, who was 4 years older than me, my mum, obviously, my grandma, and my granddad. Now, I've spoken in a video not so long ago about how boys aren't supposed to cry. Well, I think in this particular case, not having a man coming in and say, "Don't cry," was one of the best things that could have happened to me, because it meant that when my brother died, I could be sad about it and cry about it. And there was a time, well, actually at the time, I didn't particularly cry about it. Well, I did, because my sister and my mum were crying, obviously. But I didn't really process this until I was probably about 12 or 13, and it kind of suddenly hit me that I didn't have this younger brother. My brother was 2 years younger than me, and I didn't have this brother anymore which I could play with and share things with. So not only was I deprived of a father, I was also deprived of my brother. So all the men in my family were disappearing like flies. Although my granddad was a regular old woman, he was my dad for all intents and purposes. And he would play cricket with me in the garden for hours and hours during the summer. And considering he had pretty nasty arthritis and the garden was kind of down the bottom of the hill, that's such a testament to my granddad. But, you know, he was frail, old, because, you know, he was that old. Now, I think when I was about 8, 9, 10, that kind of age, I would go round to my dad's every other Saturday. You know, you have Saturday visitation rights, don't you? So I'd go round to his, and this was what usually would happen. We might play a few board games or something in the house, if it was raining, but if it wasn't, he'd probably take me and my sister to a local pub with his girlfriend, and we'd sit in there for 2 hours, and I think I was probably playing on the fruit machines with his money. He would have a few pints and so would his girlfriend, and that's kind of how it went. And after a few years, for whatever reason, we stopped going on a Saturday to his house. And to be honest with you, I was quite pleased about that, because it wasn't a fun time I was having while I was there. I couldn't wait for mum to come and pick us up again. And obviously with my mum and dad divorcing when I was 2, I never really understood that he was around. I don't even know if he was around. Maybe that was most of the problem. I never had this attachment to him. I never saw him as my dad. if you see what I mean. Not least because I saw my granddad as my dad. And the last time I spoke to my dad, I was, I think, 14, and he'd phoned the house, and I had come back after school that day. So, say about 4:30 in the afternoon, and he'd phoned from a snooker club in Exeter, because he told me where he was. And I was weirded out because I hadn't spoken to him for at least a few years. And as far as I'm aware, he'd never even phoned the house before. So he's asking me these questions and things like that. And I can tell on the other end of the phone that he's pretty drunk. And he's like, late afternoon. And I'm old enough by now to know that you shouldn't be drunk at late afternoon during the week. You should be at work at that time. Any respect I had for my dad at all had been diminished in that phone call, even though he was trying to reach out, perhaps. I don't know, it was such a weird phone call. I was in the house, I think my sister was out somewhere, so it was me and my grandma in the house, and I happened to answer the phone, because, I'm 14, I'm old enough to answer the phone. And I told my mum what had happened when she got home, that I had this phone call, and I don't know how I felt. I mean, my mum asked me how I felt, and I couldn't tell her. It was kind of like, I'm not sure I ever want to speak to him again, which is exactly the sentiment my mum had, rather understandably. But that was the last time I ever spoke to him. The next thing we know, a couple of years later, is that I get some inheritance through. But it's not from my dad. It's from his mum. I don't know if you've seen a copy of the distribution list that you get when one of your relatives die, but it lists who gets what proportion of the estate, and that's mostly so you can contest the will if you want to, and that kind of thing. And it lists the names of the relatives. Now, obviously, it's my dad's mum, so there was no reason for, considering they were divorced, for my mum to get any money. But I got a proportion, my sister got a proportion, my brother would have got a proportion if he survived. But we got an extra slice because it was listed that my dad was deceased. And that's a really odd way to find out that your dad has died. You've got the estate, what you've inherited from your grandmother on your dad's side. Only because it's on that listing have you realised, have you known that your dad has died. And again, I didn't have that much emotional attachment to my dad. It was just weird. It was just such an odd way of finding out anything. So, this is, well over a decade ago, so I'm not having any feeling about it now. But short of my granddad, I didn't have any male role models in my life. So, not even knowing when the ones that are supposed to be your role models die, I think it probably affected me in ways I didn't know. And despite me standing here talking about it and not having that much of an emotional attachment to the situation, that doesn't mean that I like talking about this kind of thing. I think it's just an important thing. I don't often talk about this to anybody. And when I do, it's because they've said something which I need to tell them why. You see, I think a lot of boys go through this because their fathers leave for whatever reason. Their mum and dads get divorced and their fathers never see them again, or hardly ever see them again. And unless I was lucky in many respects because my granddad became my dad. But that's not always possible. I mean, I grew up in a village and I think all my teachers were female. And that's not unusual in small primary schools. So it could quite easily have been the case that I had nobody of male persuasion to look up to. And if you're somebody who lives in an area where you have got men around, but they are not role models, they are not people you need to aspire to be. But as a young man, that's all you've got to see. So what do? You copy it. Because that's what you do. That's what you learn. It's so important for young boys and young girls, and people of all genders for that matter, to have good male role models. Because good male role models teach children how a man should behave, so it teaches boys how they should behave, and it teaches girls how a man should treat you, and how you should expect a man to treat you as well. For the 40,000th time in this video, I'm going to say I'm so lucky that my granddad was effectively my dad. Because firstly, my dad would not have been a good male role model, but secondly, my granddad was a fantastic role model. And I hope to be somebody that my nephews aspire to be, that my sons and daughters and whatever look up to. And it starts with respect, not just for other people, but for yourself. And I don't think that's something my dad ever had. I hope you liked this video. If you did, then do give it a thumbs up down below. I make videos every single week, which is a really good reason to subscribe. And I shall see you next time. Bye-bye.